It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Mike Frank. I've actually known Mike for many years, and I've admired his work. Actually, he's done very very interesting work about child language learning and language learning in general. So he has a storied career. He's the director of the Symbolic Systems Program in the David and Lucile Packard Foundation, a professor of human biology, and also a professor in psychology and linguistics. He did his PhD in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT with Ted Gibson. A fun fact is actually I went to Ted Gibson's wedding, and Mike Frank was there. I found out that he didn't remember me actually, but I found out today why. It's because he was jet lagged at the wedding. He had just arrived from India. He stayed up. He was awake all night after the wedding, and he actually applied to Stanford and got the job based on his application from the night after the wedding after his jet lag. So Mike's an intense person, which explains why he's accomplished so much. He has an amazing set of awards. He won the Glishko Dissertation Prize, which is one of the most prestigious dissertation prizes in psychology and cognitive science. He has a National Academy of Sciences Troland Research Award. He's won the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Sciences commendation. And it's a very, very long list of awards. But anyways, the reason I'm so excited is because he always gives great talks. And today's talk will be about bigger data for smaller people, investigating children's language learning at scale. Thanks. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks so much, Surya. Thank you to HAI for having me here at the seminar today. I'm really excited to share some of my new and ongoing work with you. Let me just reshare the screen to make sure all of the media play well. Great. So I'm looking forward to telling you a bit today about my work in developing resources to understand child development. Language learning is one of the key scientific puzzles for cognitive science. It's just amazing how we go from speechless infants to children who can understand language and use language to make their way through the world in only a few short years. Every typically developing child makes this transition. Understanding the mechanisms of language learning is an important part of understanding how to help atypical children, how to answer some deep scientific and philosophical puzzles, and in addition, it can enable speech-language technologies that are becoming increasingly ubiquitous and that we want to adapt to our conversational style in much the way that children do. Language explodes onto the scene. So here's my daughter, Madeline, now almost 8. In this picture, she's 18 months old, and the longest thing she's ever said is happy birthday, which she expressed as happy bee. At 19 months, she said blue ball, combining words together in a compositional way for the first time, and I was a very proud psycholinguist parent. At 23 months, she said, "Spike doggy, no food, eat dirt." That's referring to my mother-in-law's dog, Spike, and she was saying he doesn't eat food, he eats dirt, which is a true observation. By 26 months, she's a teenager already, and she says, "Dada, move own body. Mine need a little bit more space." So at 26 months, she's a little bit taller. She's a little bit, she weighs a little bit more. She's got longer hair, a little bit more dirt on her face, but physically she's pretty unchanged. And we can put that in comparison to the massive change in expressive capacity that's happened over these months. So we want to understand how this explosion happens. But when we go to textbooks on language development, what we get is basically an ages and stages model, a redescription of the phenomenon. You see a chart of the stages of speech and language development, or a set of discrete milestones that refer to particular experimental phenomena that have been measured in the lab. Or even cruder, just a set of descriptions of the stage your child is at. So these aren't really mechanistic theories of language development. And this isn't just an academic issue. A lack of theory leads to lost opportunities to help kids. It's been much remarked upon that children's vocabulary development, their language learning, seems to be stratified by socioeconomic status. So this is a famous figure from a seminal study by Hart and Risley that noted that lower socioeconomic status kids growing up in lower socioeconomic status households were hearing less language at home and were producing fewer words. And this in turn set them up for academic failure when they reached school, because it was harder to learn to read. Their knowledge of language wasn't as solid, and so connecting spoken language to written language was harder. Since this initial finding, there's been a flurry of activity around trying to understand this, quote, word gap, this gap in achievement in early vocabulary learning that we think is critical for setting the stage for early academic success. And for my purposes, the most important thing is that none of this work really refers back to the body of theory on language development. So there's a lost opportunity to use a better theoretical understanding to inform policy interventions. And that's a shame, because everyone, when they talk about this kind of language learning, has more or less the same vague theory in mind. They think that kids get language input from the environment around them. Then in the moment, they're doing some real-time predictive processing about the speech they hear in order to figure out what people are talking about and what their intended meaning is. And then they use that processing to inform their longer-term learning about the meanings of words and how to combine them. My question is whether we can formalize this kind of vague theory and put it in contact with data. And that's really what I've spent my career trying to do. In my earlier work, I tried to develop probabilistic models that instantiate this kind of theory, taking as their starting point simple situations where a child and a caregiver interact around a set of grounded reference, for example, a dog and a pig, and the challenge of the child is trying to map the word doggy to the stuffed dog rather than the stuffed pig. These models provide a quantitative framework for thinking about the different factors involved in early language learning, and they do quite well at explaining very tiny timescales. For example, what could be learned in a moment-to-moment interaction. If we think about these learning models in a schematic way, they instantiate our scientific hypotheses about learning, and so they're useful artifacts for trying to test and tease apart different hypotheses. But if we look at the learning paradigm in which these scientific hypotheses are grounded, it maybe falls short. We feed in input predictors, but the input predictors are just a few hours of annotated video, or in some other work, artificial data that's made up to try and create something like the child's learning environment. And then the outcomes we evaluate on are just a handful of binary experimental results. Children at age 6 months do this, at age 2 years do that. So working in this paradigm for a couple of years, it became my firm conviction that we need more data to do well on these questions. And of course, I was starting to have these thoughts at a time when it was becoming very clear in AI and machine learning that data was, as Halevi and Norvig and Pereira called it, unreasonably effective. So maybe the idea here is that the learning mechanism proposals are pretty good. We just need more data. But unfortunately, data are only effective if you have them. And here's the thing. Thinking about child language poses both a theoretical and a practical puzzle around data availability. Here's the theoretical issue. Each dot on the screen right now represents 50 million words of training input. And the gray dots here show what GPT-3, a state-of-the-art language model that can do some amazing things, has access to in its training. That's 500 billion words. That little half of a red dot in the upper left-hand corner, that's what the average 2-year-old has. Maybe, generously speaking, 25 million words of input. So this data disconnect is striking. 20,000 times less data is required for a 2-year-old than a language model. Now, of course, the 2-year-old can't write fake news stories yet, but they can also do a lot of things in terms of adapting to their scenario that maybe the language model would struggle with. So our question is whether we can evaluate learning models on children's learning inputs and on their learning outcomes. And if we did that, what data would we use? That's the topic of this talk. Because, of course, the practical difficulty is we don't have 500 billion words worth of what a child hears. In fact, we don't even have 25 million words. So in order to implement this kind of training and testing regime where we look at children's real learning inputs and their real outcomes, we're going to need to build some resources. So today, I'm going to be telling you about a series of resources that I've created to try to address this issue. To capture children's language input, we've tried to systematize transcripts of children's available speech, and then go beyond that to capture their multimodal input. To measure their processing, we've created Peakbank, which aggregates data about their real-time online processing of language. And to capture their outcomes, we've created Wordbank, which tracks children's large-scale language development across cultures and languages. These resources then can be assembled into a predictive framework for fitting models, in which richer input data can inform hypotheses about the learning mechanisms and then can be evaluated on real outcome data from children across a variety of contexts. Just a little aside, this is much closer to the newest way of thinking about evaluating machine learning models. So rather than doing supervised training on large, expensive data sets like ImageNet, increasingly, models are trained in a semi or self-supervised way on much larger data sets that are naturally occurring, and then they're evaluated in a zero-shot or few-shot way on meaningful outcomes. That's a lot like this particular setup here, where we train on resources in an unsupervised way, and then we evaluate on meaningful outcomes that are far outside of the sample that we're training on. All right, hopefully that's just a little aside for those of you interested in the machine learning context here. But now let me tell you a little bit about each of the resources that we've created. I'll start with the input resources. Now, I'm very lucky to be working in the field of child language because we start from a backdrop of more data availability than many branches of psychology. In particular, a resource called the Child Language Data Exchange System, or CHILDS, is a key resource for this field. And for the past 30 to 40 years, CHILDS has been exchanging transcripts with formatting and metadata on all of the extant data that are out there. So this is kind of the original big data for child language. They provide a shared research environment with open tools. So this is a really wonderful resource for scholars that's really catalyzed the field and that has inspired me to create similar resources that allow open access to the data that enable new investigations. So the first project I just want to mention is that building on the CHILDS archive, we've created CHILDSDB, which is a flexible, reproducible interface to CHILDS. And this introduces some of our design principles. For example, we create programmatic access through an application programming interface, or API, which allows folks coding up machine learning models to tap directly into the data with a standardized prep and with a versioning infrastructure so that they can reproduce a specific version of the data set and get the same numbers out as a previous user. We also create online explorable visualizations. I'll show you some of these for another data resource in a moment, that allow scholars of child language who don't want to code up new analyses to explore a little bit in a more free-form way. So this helps systematize some of the text and transcript data that are available already to scholars. But we wanted to go beyond these kinds of resources to really try to understand the multimodal input to children. And to do this, we launched the SayCam project. SayCam gathers egocentric video from cameras on children's heads. And this was enabled by 3 developmental psychologists who are about to have kids and were very interested in the nature of those children's input. So they agreed to a massive study in which for 2 hours a week, from age 6 months to age 30 months, they would put the camera on the child's head. This resulted in more than 400 hours of egocentric video, as well as lots of cute selfies like this one, and annotations of context. So are we in the garden? Are we in the kitchen? Are we having mealtime? Are we doing diaper changing? As well as some speech transcriptions. Just to give you a flavor for how different this egocentric video is from your classic iPhone videos, I just want to show a little excerpt from a play session. So you can see here that the child's perspective is really quite different from the adult's perspective. They're much closer to objects. You'll see in a moment that the hands of their caregivers and their own hands tend to impinge on the frame as they manipulate things. The social signals they see, like faces, are much more often rotated, occluded, generally in unfamiliar configurations. So standard computer vision algorithms that are trained on web-style corpora, web-style data sets simply don't perform well on these data sets. It's a real challenge to think about what kinds of computations are enabled by children's visual input. Just to give one example of how this kind of corpus can be used in AI, Chung-Shu Shuang and Dan Yeamans have been using these data to develop unsupervised models for visual representation learning. The basic idea behind these kinds of models is that they learn what are called contrastive embeddings. These are representations that are optimized to maximize the similarity of related images while minimizing the similarity of distinct images. So these are essentially completely unsupervised representation algorithms that don't require a lot of tagged or labeled data. In a recent paper, Chung-Shu used SayCam, the data you just saw, to train a variant of these algorithms that was optimized for video, known as video instance embeddings. So the idea here then is the video really tells you what frames are similar to one another because they're close in time. And one of the many cool results in this paper is that the representations learned by unsupervised methods, shown here in red, were actually almost as closely related to neural activity, specifically in inferotemporal cortex, or IT, as the representations learned by state-of-the-art supervised categorizations on ImageNet. So despite the small size or smaller size of the data set for SayCam and the massively noisier and more complex data set, these unsupervised algorithms still are able to predict neural activity, presumably because the representations they're learning are actually closer to the representations that people have from similar input. So I think this result is really cool, and it's a nice example of the general idea I was discussing, that if we use human-sized data sets, we can get a better sense of how human learning must use the data. And so a natural future direction here is to create even denser and more well-instrumented egocentric video data sets that could allow us to really validate human-scale models. And we're pursuing this currently with funding from HAI, actually. Just want to acknowledge the Hoffman E. Grant program that's really pushed this research forward. Okay, on to the second set of resources that I wanted to tell you about, Peakbank and Wordbank. I'll start actually with Wordbank here. So transcripts of child language are very useful for studying children's input, but to study their outcomes, many specialists rely on what are known as the CDI forms, the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventories. And these are surprisingly low tech. They are basically a checklist, a bubble sheet, in which parents fill in, for example, me filling in for Madeline at age 1, the child's productive vocabulary, which in some cases is quite small, as well as an estimate of their receptive vocabulary. So we check off whether the child says or understands words like hi, bye, ball, dog, more, milk, mommy, and so forth. And the striking fact about these checklists is that parents are actually quite keen observers of their own children. So they actually get quite reliable and valid estimates of the child's overall vocabulary size and language development. And these estimates can be used for research as well as for clinical screening, which has led to these forms being adapted for a variety of different languages. And in fact, around now, there are more than 100 adaptations across different languages with different states of normative data and publication and so forth. So all of these adaptations create a real opportunity. And now about 5 or 6 years ago, my collaborators and I started reaching out to folks who had done these adaptations and asking whether they'd be willing to share their raw data so that we could format them in a single unified format and make them openly accessible in a database, which we now call Wordbank. So Wordbank is a database that allows programmatic and web-based access to all of the word-by-word, child-by-child data here from over 75,000 children across more than 29 languages, growing as we speak. So this becomes a resource where you can really think about children's learning outcomes in a nuanced way and create new analyses. So here are the interactive visualizations I was talking about. So if you go on the web and you want to look into a particular question about child language, you can browse all of our data interactively. Here's just an example. Say you're interested in German, go through the various different languages that are available. And you can think about if you want to split this by metadata. For example, maybe you're interested in gender or sex effects. You could look at the median difference between females and males, and you see this widely reported gender difference. So females have an advantage. You might be interested if that's true in Korean, which it is, or maybe you want to test this out in Swedish. and indeed it's true in Swedish as well. So this is just a kind of quick example of how these visualizations can be used as an informal exploration tool by researchers, or they can be used in teaching or by parents or other interested parties to learn about children's language development. In fact, since this is the largest database to our knowledge of children's learning outcomes, we've actually really focused in much of our work on trying to evaluate prior hypotheses about language learning on this big data set. And although I won't talk more about this effort today, that's been a major focus of our research in the past couple of years, leading to a book from MIT Press that was just released this spring, which is called Variability and Consistency in Early Language Learning, the Wordbank Project. That's with my collaborators, Mika Brzezinski, Dan Yurovsky, and Virginia Martman. And if you're interested in this kind of descriptive work on child language, I'd encourage you to look at wordbankbook.stanford.edu. That's a freely available open copy of this book that you can explore. It actually contains code for exploring the database if you're interested in diving in more deeply. So the Wordbank database provides us with a resource for understanding big trends in children's language learning across languages and across age. But it doesn't help us capture the moment-to-moment dynamics of language processing. My colleague and former mentor, Anne Fernald, devoted her career to measuring those dynamics of processing, and she did so by developing a now gold standard paradigm called the looking while listening paradigm. This is a very simple but very powerful paradigm in which a child is videotaped as they're asked to do something like look at the cookie, or look at the ball, or look at the book. And this is in a two alternative situation where there's a cookie on one side of the screen and a book or a ball on the other side, and their eye movements and the relationship of those eye movements to the spoken language can be measured and analyzed. So here's just one example of a paper using this paradigm in which children acquiring sign language and adults who are fluent in native speakers of sign language, and American Sign Language specifically, were measured as they did this word recognition task and as they moved their eyes from the signer in the middle to the target. And what you see is that adults are very fast and accurate at recognizing the referent here. So just a few hundred milliseconds after hearing the beginning or seeing the beginning of the ball sign, they're already looking at the ball. 2-year-olds, slightly older than 2 and slightly younger than 2, are slower, but still getting there, even showing some hints of moving before the sign is finished. And the older children tend to be faster and come to a higher asymptote. So this is just one example finding, but there are parallel results from this paradigm in studies with many diverse populations of children in the US, including late talkers, children born premature, bilinguals, Spanish and English speakers from lower and higher SES families, and so forth. And across these numerous studies, you find these very consistent patterns, like accuracy increasing with age and being correlated with vocabulary, and maybe even predicting vocabulary in the future. So again, we were able to take advantage of the presence of these data from many different labs and start an aggregation project, which is known as Peakbank. This is a very new project, but we are beginning to put the data from looking while listening studies into a database format. And this project is more intense from an infrastructure perspective, which makes it a fun technical challenge because, of course, eye tracking data are highly heterogeneous based on the particular experiment that's being done and the particular measurement instrument that's being used. So there's a data standardization and formatting challenge that makes it both fun and difficult to get all these data together. This is very new work, as I mentioned, but just to give you a sense of this resource, here are data from over 1,300 children across 15 data sets. The data are heterogeneous with respect to age, language, stimulus, and many other details of the analysis process. Nevertheless, in every one of these, you can see the signature of word recognition and action, this characteristic rise in the proportion of the looking at the target just a few hundred milliseconds after the target word, and the target word here is shown as the 0 point, this line. One fun initial development here is that we can use these data to fit regression models that control for all of the various sources of heterogeneity. And these regression models allow us to extract broader developmental functions like the one pictured here, where you see predicted changes in both the speed and the accuracy of word recognition across age. I think this is an exciting theoretical development because it confirms some of these long-standing early hypotheses by Anne Fernald and others about developmental changes in speed and accuracy and how they continue across all of childhood. But it's also really useful because we can start using these model fits as an endpoint for predictive modeling. In other words, these estimates of children's processing, once they're stripped of all of this variability related to the specifics of the experiment and the stimuli and so forth, can be used as an endpoint evaluation. And that brings us to the last section of my talk, which is starting to use these resources to evaluate hypotheses about learning mechanisms. So I was inspired by this collaboration that I engaged in, actually started in graduate school, working with Deb Roy, Brandon Roy, and the data from the Human Speechome Project. If you're not familiar with the Speechome Project, this is a massive undertaking by Deb Roy's lab at MIT. Right before the birth of his first child, he instrumented his home with ceiling-mounted cameras and boundary layer microphones and captured an incredible data set about his child's first months of life. The raw data went from around age 0 to about 36 months old, 200 terabytes of data with around 100,000 hours of audio and video. Brandon Roy spent who has no relation, by the way, to Deb Roy, spent his entire PhD overseeing the transcription of this work by hand because automatic speech recognition was not up to the task. This resulted in almost 9 million words of speech available in the environment of the child. Just to give you a flavor for what this data set looks like, here's a matrix of cameras, and you can see how a day in the life unfolds with the lights going on, everybody getting ready, privacy shutters for getting dressed, breakfast, folks going out, child playing with the nanny, coming home, lights going on, mealtime, bedtime, and the lights going out. So there are many fabulous things you can do with these kinds of data. Just one of them, though, was the spark for our predictive modeling approach, because we decided that we could predict when words were learned in this data set. And we created regression models that put together different information sources in the environment of the child to try to make a good guess as to when the child learned specific words. You can see here we added in a variety of different predictors like the frequency of words, their length, the utterances they were in, a whole bunch of predictors about the words, as well as their environments in the multimodal input, where and when they were said in the home. And we were able to construct models that predicted a decent chunk of the variance in this child's learning outcomes. So that was exciting, but more broadly, it suggested that this predictive modeling approach might be a valuable tool for assessing different hypotheses about the information sources available to children. So in order to move from the context of a single child, predicting when this child would utter this word, to a cross-linguistic prediction enterprise, we needed to think about predicting average trajectories. So this is the work of Mika Brzezinski when they were in my lab. They extracted data from Wordbank across 10 different languages. We got the trajectory of acquisition across age for words. I think it ended up being about 400 words. Shown here are dog and jump. And the goal is to predict these curves across languages, basically taking input predictors from the child language data exchange system. So the input that was given to kids learning these languages, not the same kids, but the average input to a kid learning Croatian or Danish or English, and then put them through a learning model, which here is a very simple regression model, and then predict to these word bank outcomes, these average acquisition trajectories. So rather than predicting for this child when will they learn this word, we're instead predicting the average age of acquisition based on the average frequency across children. Now, there were a lot of interesting findings on the specific information sources that were important here. I won't go into those in too much detail. You can see here that word frequency matters, word length matters, the mean length of utterances that the words are spoken in matters. So all things that have been shown in prior studies and that we saw in the study of an individual child in the speechome corpus. So that generally confirmed our idea that this approach was viable. The really interesting finding, though, from this study was that the predictors that were successful and useful in one language were the same ones that were useful in another language. So the average correlation between predictor values across languages was very high. It was actually quite close to the noise ceiling and far exceeded the random baseline. And this is a theoretically really interesting insight from the perspective of language acquisition, because across 10 languages, which are kind of different from one another in a variety of different ways, the same information sources seem to matter for learners. So this suggested a real consistency in learning mechanisms, confirming some earlier hypotheses in child language about these kinds of universal processes that go on and drive language acquisition, at least at a high level. These predictive models also provide a baseline that we can compare to future models, augmenting these with more predictors and trying to understand whether we can do better at capturing the relationship between these inputs and these outcomes. So we're starting to get into the virtuous cycle where we can try to really explain more variance and get better performance on this prediction challenge, and that then in turn tells us more about the nature of language learning. I'll just show you two of those efforts. The first is the work of Abdella Fortassi, who's now a professor in Marseille, but was a postdoc in my lab. Abdella was interested in creating what are known as semantic or lexical networks. So these are networks that derive their edges from semantic structures. In particular, here we're using word embeddings from a vector space semantic model, Word2Vec. And you can see how these lexical networks develop over time. So this is the age of the child changing. You can see that the semantic network gets bigger as the vocabulary gets bigger, more words start to get connected. And as the child reaches age 2 or 3, you start to get these really interesting semantic structures with big clusters around areas of interest and expertise like animals, vehicles, words for food, words for body parts, common objects, and so forth. Now, the really fascinating finding from Abdella's work was that the network geometry here, the meaning relations that are encoded by that network geometry, actually predicts age of acquisition of words, predicts which words were learned earlier or later. And that's over and above the prior model that I just showed you. So we use the prior predictive framework as a baseline for moving forward and creating new predictions that built on that with this network geometry. So what that suggests is the semantic relationships, the meaning relationships between words are actually driving what kids are learning next. The last piece of work I want to tell you about is work by Eva Portelance, who's a current PhD student in the linguistics department. Again, Eva was interested in supplementing these predictive models of language learning. Her particular interest was in supplementing their ability to predict which words were learned on the basis of not the semantic structures, but the syntactic structures in language. So what she did was adding a neural language model, in this case, a long short-term memory model, an LSTM, as a predictor of acquisition. And so she trained this LSTM not on giant web-scale corpora, but rather just on those child language data exchange data, of course, extracted from ChildThisDB programmatically because we had created that resource and she was able to use it in this study. So she trains up the model and then she asks which words are relatively most surprising to that model. That is, which are syntactically unpredicted. Which ones are kind of maybe hard to recognize or hard to process on the basis of that unpredictability. And then she uses that unpredictability as a predictor in our acquisition model. So what you see here is the increase in performance accuracy across words for adding this LSTM surprise, this signal of unpredictability. And the words that are most improved in their predictions are words like you, none, off, on, other, down, out, that, who, why. These are function words, as they're called, those small elements of language that are uniquely hard to acquire because they don't refer to a particular object or action in the environment. They're instead syntactic words that tie together different words and indicate relations or syntactic roles. And so this study suggests that the language model surprisal helps to improve predictions, but it does so very specifically for function words and then for predicates and not at all for nouns. So a better understanding of the sequential dynamics of language here then leads to better predictions about what kids are learning. Now, just to mention that all three of these studies that I've shown you are out of sample evaluation, right? We train on a particular data set and then we go wildly outside of that data set to look at a totally different task, predicting age of acquisition. So there's none of the supervised learning dynamic where we're annotating a corpus and saying this is the ground truth, this is the right answer. Instead, what we're doing is we're taking resources that describe children's input and using them to predict children's outcomes. And I think this is a powerful framework that's very aligned with work in machine learning and artificial intelligence that allows us to make scientific insights by using better resources. So that brings me to my broader conclusions. What I argued today is that building theories of child language requires better data resources. We all have the same vague verbal theory, but getting beyond that and trying to really understand how the pieces go together in a way that can let us help children and help us develop technologies, that's really going to require better data and more data. Further, these resources can provide dividends because they can allow us to interface with new unsupervised models in AI, like Changshu and Dan's, where we're really trying to understand what can be learned from the input that's available to a human child. It really constrains our hypotheses about learning mechanisms and makes us make better use of the data than we do in large-scale web-based corpora where we can get essentially unlimited data. More broadly speaking, what I'm really most interested in here is connecting resources to create predictive models. These predictive models can lead to new scientific developments because by predicting more of the variation in children's outcomes, we can learn what information sources and what mechanisms are most meaningful, and in turn start to answer our questions about the broader emergence of language. Thank you very much for listening today. Thanks to my supporters and sponsors and to the lab members that contributed here. I'd be very happy to take your questions.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Mike. I'll applaud for the audience on behalf of the audience. Yeah, so by the way, if you have questions, if you click on the chat window in Zoom, you'll get a link to Slido, and you can ask your questions in Slido right there, and I can read them off. We already have a bunch of questions in there. There's a cluster of questions that relate to, I think there's a lot of parents of children who are asking questions on Slido, but they're related to bilingual versus monolingual children, and what if they, speak their home language, or even if you have two parents who speak different home languages, and then they learn the language of their current country later. What's known about differences between children who are brought up bilingual and monolingual, and what about slightly later language learning that starts maybe in kindergarten for a new language?
Yeah, these are great questions and ones that are on the minds of many parents, me included. So let me first start with bilingualism and what's known, and then I'll talk a little bit about how our research intersects. So bilingualism is amazing. I think the first thing to say is that growing up multilingual is probably the default in the world, and growing up monolingual, the way I did in the US, is actually probably more unusual than growing up multilingual, as many kids do in many of the nations of the world. What does being multilingual get you? It gets you speaking many languages. There's this big debate about whether it's going to make your brain stronger, make you age slower, and so forth. My reading of that literature is conservative. I do not think that it does any of those things. I think being multilingual is great because you can speak multiple languages and interface with multiple cultures and talk to more people. And so that's why you should teach your kid to be bilingual. Bilingual acquisition, because it's the norm, it goes forward very typically. It's very straightforward. There's an initial period of confusion about the languages for many kids where they're kind of mixing between the languages, but that usually gets straightened out pretty quickly. There are occasional cases that that confusion can be longer lasting and can intersect with other language disorders that can get complex when you have a child who has other reasons for having a speech language delay, perhaps production difficulties, perhaps comprehension difficulties. And so bilingualism is an important topic for clinicians because we need to tease out initial confusion about the bilingual environment from broader delays that require intervention. So on that note, predictive models like the ones that I try to work with can be an important tool for trying to tease those things apart because we can set good expectations about what should be happening with a bilingual based on their exposure to different languages. And that's precisely where our research is going. So we're not there yet. Much of the data now, nearly all of the data in Wordbank is monolingual data and was designed to be that way. But we're starting to incorporate some bilingual corpora. And we're beginning, actually, this is really a major research push that we're doing right now to try to generalize these predictive models to bilingual scenarios where you get a mixture of input data from one language and another, and the parameter on that mixture can be altered depending on the particular environment that the child is growing up in. So that's the current goal, and that's going to lead, we hope, to better assessments and better ability to provide kind of good normative feedback for clinicians about when you need to intervene and when things are going just fine.
Okay, great, thanks. There's another cluster of questions that could be interpreted as the concerned parent questions about, various relationships between intrinsic childhood intelligence, education versus economic status on language development. So we can start maybe with something that's close to the interest of Hai is the impact of AI on society, democratizing education, and so forth, and whether AI will alleviate or help inequality. So let's start with economic status, right? So I'm aware that there's many studies that show that vocabulary size relate to socioeconomic status and so forth. I'm curious, do any of your studies or the studies of other people in this field explicitly index on economic status and look for correlations between child language development time course and economic status of the parents?
That is something we can look at in these data. We don't have a single international index for socioeconomic status, and that in itself is an important research issue. But what we can do is look at a proxy that's useful in understanding this, which is the maternal education level. So in general, moms with higher socioeconomic status have higher educational attainment, and it's a decent index. And what we find when we look at that is actually that you see real stratification by maternal education. You see that across many different countries, but the size of that stratification is actually quite different. So if you look at classically social democracies in Northern Europe, you see that stratification being very small. And now, of course, this is just pure correlation with many sampling issues, but one might be tempted to speculate that the smallness of that stratification across socioeconomic status is due to progressive social policies, for example, greater maternal leave, greater access to care that might decrease the differences in the home environment for kids from different kinds of homes.
So, just to ask a follow up on that, I was curious, relative to Western Europe and America, what is the spread in language development as a function of social status, socioeconomic status?
Big.
I see.
Yeah, that gap is bigger in our data set, or in across actually a number of data sets in the US. And our current research is aimed at trying to do this sort of work in a nationally representative sample in the US to really try to understand the specific contributions of multilingual language background, race and ethnicity, as well as different proxies for socioeconomic status. So we're not there yet to say, hey, this is the right number. We haven't estimated it perfectly, but all indications are that that gap is larger in the US than it is in a number of other nations.
It's interesting. Related to this question, you show beautifully that you could track and predict the probability of word acquisition on average across kids and so forth. There were some questions in the Slido about outliers. The phrase they use was so-called genius kids. But if you analyze, for example, the outlier kids who learn more words earlier, can you correlate that with any aspects of all this other data that you have, like SayCam or so forth? What this question literally asked was, have we learned anything about best management practices for raising kids from studying the outliers?
Yeah, so well, let me talk a little bit about the distribution in general, and then we can talk
Uh,
about what the best practices are. So one of the really interesting things, if somebody asked me what we discovered from Wordbank as opposed to what we confirmed or figured out, the thing that I would say I discovered is the variability of kids' early language. It turns out that by any metric you want to use, kids are all over the place with respect to language. So if you look at a sample of toddlers, they're, the mean is, of course, a number you can compute, but the standard deviation is just as big as the mean. That is, for your garden variety 2-year-old, they could be not talking at all, or they could be saying complete sentences that are clear as a bell. And you'll probably see all of those things in any given preschool classroom that you walk into. So variability is the norm, and that's true across cultures. That's not just a feature of US stratification across demographics or something like this. So I think that's very interesting. Now, what it says to me about best practices is that we might get a little bit caught up as parents by this variation, and we might be tempted to interpret it as reflecting on our specific style. And I think all the evidence that we have suggests that that variation is to a decent extent intrinsic to the child rather than extrinsic.
mm,
So, what do we know about best practices for child rearing? Well, what you want to do is provide a supportive environment, provide loving care, allow the child to explore creatively, to learn from their environment, to follow their interests. So, I actually don't think that that is something that we want to index on the specific developmental level of the child, especially as related to their vocabulary. What we want instead to do is to create the kind of environment, again, based on the child's level, but always seeking for an environment where they're exploring and we're following their interests, because a lot of the research does suggest that following the child's own interests is much more effective at engaging them and leading to learning opportunities for language as well as for other kinds of knowledge.
right. Great. Yeah, it reminds me of a joke that I once heard that said every parent should have at least 2 kids so they realize the first kid is not their fault. Um, anyways, but
I think that's totally wise. It relates to something. So my father-in-law is a speech language pathologist, and
uh,
what he says is more of an in joke for researchers. But he says, the first kid you're convinced that it's nurture that makes the difference. Everything you do is
right.
consequential. But the second kid you become a nativist. You assume that it's all nature because you see how different they are. You did all the same stuff, and the outcome is very different. And I certainly think that that's true as a parent of two.
That's funny. Yeah, my first kid is going well, so I do think it's nurture. But I'm about to have a second kid. I'm going to find out how I had nothing to do with it. But
Congratulations.
uh,
Yeah, you'll figure out
thanks.
that nothing is your fault.
Yeah, I know you went through that transition recently. Okay, let's see. So there's a multilingualism. So one question asked that they noticed that in one of the studies, I think when you're looking at 10 languages simultaneously, they were all sort of Western European languages. And they were asking more about Asian languages that have, very different character sets, very different structures. What kind of studies are being done on those at scale? Are there large data sets for those languages, and so forth?
Yeah, we do have quite a number of data sets now on Mandarin, on Cantonese. Um, we're hoping a new data set will come in on Japanese. So we have a bunch of East Asian languages represented, and we're right now in the process of generalizing some of these predictive analyses to those corpora. So the high level summary, I think, is that the process of acquisition is quite similar across different languages, including the East Asian languages. But there is one really interesting point of divergence, which is that in East Asian languages, especially Mandarin and Cantonese, we see a much greater proportion of verbs in kids' early speech as opposed to nouns. And
Oh, interesting.
yeah, I think it's very cool. And our data suggests that it's likely not with certainty, but likely caused by different ways of talking to kids and the different kinds of verbs that are available. So, when I'm reflecting on talking to kids in English and I'm saying, what's all similar about making a mess, making your bed, and making dinner? It's like you're causing something to happen, but wow, that's a pretty abstract relation to have to learn. If you have a much more specific verb, I like to think of the Yiddish verb schlepp, it means carry a heavy thing. That's a much
Right,
easier word to learn. It has a lot of perceptual correlates. And the
right,
indication is that there are a lot more verbs like that in Mandarin and Cantonese compared with English, where these light verbs that have very abstract meanings are more common. So that seems to be one reason why kids learn a little bit differently in Mandarin and Cantonese. But overall, I think that the broader trends, especially being driven by input and so forth, those hold up quite nicely and are quite similar.
See, very interesting. Um, these language models are all the rage at the moment, right? These very, very large language models. And you nicely pointed out that they require a lot of information, a lot more information than kids require in order to learn good predictive models of language, at least. Um, I was wondering about the differences between the language models processing capabilities at the end of training and maybe kids or even adults processing capabilities. What do you see as the biggest, so if we factor out the amount of data required to arrive at the final product, either for an adult or language model, after you factor that out, what do you see as the biggest differences between these language models and adult language production and comprehension?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in actually the other Hoffman-Yee funded HAI project that I'm working on, we've been analyzing GPT-3 in some depth and trying to compare it to human performance. And I think one of the big things that we see as different is that it can embody some sort of sense of goal and context and discourse, but it does so in a very restricted way that's all kind of glommed together in the single prompt we give it. And what we think about human beings is that actually they're really good at incorporating a very broad universe of goals and contexts and discourses. And all of that goes into the speech they produce and the way they comprehend others' speech. So, our long-term history of interaction, Surya, that can be informing the way I talk to you. I assume that you know things because I've heard you talk in a particular way years ago. And it's not that a language model couldn't be in principle conditioned on that. It's just that right now they don't do that. They don't reason about that backdrop that's specific and adapted to an individual. They don't reason about the reason why we're talking right now in the kind of rationally integrative way that humans do. And so that's actually a kind of another line of my research, has been thinking about how that integration process happens in kids and adults. And I think it's a fascinating one because it really makes us such flexible communicators. And right now, it's not to say that language models could never do that, but right now they just don't.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, right? Language models don't have goals and intentions. Another kind of point of controversy in AI is the notion of can we model language in isolation, or do we need to ground language in an embodied experience in the real world? And so I thought the SayCam data was really interesting. So there you have the video and audio of kids. Just a couple of technical questions there. So you have the camera mounted on the head, so you're not capturing the eye movements and the foveation patterns of the kids. And so the foveated images that they see could be very different from what the camera sees. Do you have a sense of how much you're missing by doing that, or is it not that much? Or yeah, what's sort of your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of early studies on these head cameras were comparing them to what if we were tracking eye movements. And, you know, in the short time scale, your eyes move around very quickly and foveate different aspects of the scene. So you're moving your eyes a couple times a second, 2, 3, 4 times a second. In contrast, the head is much slower to move. It's much heavier, but it does tend to get there on average. So it's very weird to have a conversation where you're consistently foveating a thing that's not actually at the center of the vector coming from your head. So you could think of it as a time smooth signal on where the child is looking. That's one way to think about it. But kind of another response is I actually think it's really important to think about what's available to the child in any given time. And here's one reason. Like if you think about my son Jonah is kind of down at my knees playing when I'm making dinner. And I don't think he ever fixates my knees. They're not that interesting. And I don't think he really wants to go way up here and fixate my face. But he knows that all that stuff is there. It's available in the field of view in the periphery. He's kind of tracking it as probably tracking my position as an object or as an agent. And so that's very important. So from a kind of social and context perspective, having a broader field of view of what's available might actually be more important than knowing precisely this fixation or that fixation in the moment dynamics.
Right. And then following up on that, it was intriguing that self-supervised learning on the SimCam data could yield neural networks that could predict neural activity, I guess, in macaque monkeys. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, the reason these language models have caught the world by storm is because you can then transfer the representations to solve interesting tasks. I was wondering if the visual representations learned by SimCam, by doing self-supervised learning on video data from SimCam, using so little data, could actually transfer to solve any kind of benchmark tasks in machine learning beyond sort of predicting neural activity in monkeys.
Yeah, it's exactly the right question, and that's very much what Chung-Shu and Dan are doing. I think the current take home is you do much better than you'd expect from that little data, but you're not going to beat the supervised baselines yet. It's very sample efficient, and presumably because the samples are from a better distribution, you're doing better, but you're not. We're not world beaters at the hard baselines yet. But that's precisely the reason why we want to get the actual experience of a full kid. Maybe that's out of reach, but
actually, I wasn't.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't asking about can you beat the supervised baselines. I was wondering if you can beat the self-supervised baselines, where you just do self-supervised learning and then train on a few images, or for the downstream task of interest.
Yeah, I believe we're close to the self-supervised ImageNet baseline, but not there.
And that's actually very encouraging, because you do have a lot less data there.
Yeah. So I what Dan was just talking to me, and he said, I don't need 100x more data, but if you got 10x more data, could you do that? I was like, well,
that's the typical theorist request of experimentalists is just, can you give me more data?
I'm sure it wouldn't be 10x more work. Come on, Mike.
Exactly. Let's see. You had this intriguing finding that the same information sources mattered for predicting, I think it was word acquisition, across many different languages. I was wondering if you could kind of dive a little bit deeper into what those common predictive information sources were.
Yeah, great. That's very much what our focus was on in that paper. And the top one is how often the word is said in the child's environment. So I conceptualize a lot of word learning as an accumulation process. Each word is a bucket, drops in the bucket. When the bucket is full, the child knows the word, and those buckets are of different sizes for different words. Common nouns tend to be the smallest buckets. They're easiest to fill. But one other interesting one that is, I think, a little underappreciated is that the child's own interests actually are a very strong predictor. And so if you look across those 10 languages, and indeed across our full sample, you see that the first words that kids learn are very similar across languages. So if you're growing up learning Hindi or Turkish or Russian or English, you tend to talk about the people in your environment. So your caregivers, your family, you tend to talk about small objects like balls and dogs and so forth. And you tend to talk about meaningful routines like pick me up, peekaboo, bath time, hi, bye, uh-oh. These are not the most frequent things. They're the most interesting, cool, useful things. And they're captured in our model by a predictor that's terrible. It's called babiness. But it's really, literally, the finding is that things that babies like are similar across the world, and babies learn to talk about those things early on. And they're mostly social stuff.
I see. Yeah, for my son, it was bus. I remember, when he was like a year and a half old, he was sleeping, in his sleep. He was just yelling out, bus, bus. He must have been dreaming out a bus. He loves buses, loved buses.
Yeah, vehicles are, maybe the next one on that list.
Got it.
Mostly for boys.
Got it. We didn't even get to talk about gender. Actually, let's just, one more question. You just brought it up, gender differences. Are there kind of statistically robust gender differences very, very early on for kids that could be kind of provably factored? You could control for maybe nurture effects. I don't even know if that's possible, but just more generally, what's robust gender effects differences do you see in early language learning?
Yeah, so this is not a causal intervention, so you can't tell the causal effect of genetics for biological sex. But if you expected that socialization was the key factor in vocabulary and gender socialization, you'd expect more variation across the world in gender effects, and you don't see that. You see that across the world there is a medium size effect of being female such that you learn more words. There's also aside from the kind of mean shift that girls learn a bit this much better, there's also some outliers on the girl side and some outliers on the boy side. And on the boy side, it's truck and bus and hammer. And on the girl side, it's doll and dress. And those are very consistent across languages. So you do see both gender stereotyped interests and also a general effect of girls tend to learn all the words a bit better.
See, got it. Okay, we're about out of time. So thanks so much, Mike. I'll clap for you again. It was a fascinating talk. I think there's a lot of interest in what you're working on for many good, really good reasons.
Thanks, Surya, for the great questions.
Yeah, and well, thanks to Slido also. All right, so I'll see you on the other side, Mike. All right.
Sounds great.
Okay,
Thanks,
take care.
everybody.